The gunshot still rang in Zachariah Jones's ears long after the bullet had torn through his chest, missing his heart by a whisper. It was 1878, and he had made his choice the day he'd pinned on that silver star, becoming sheriff of Cottonwood Springs, a choice that brought him to this moment. Lying in the dust of Main Street with a gang of outlaws fleeing into the distance, and the town doctor frantically working to save his life. "Don't you die on me, Sheriff," Dr. Holliday muttered, his wrinkled hands working deftly to stem the bleeding. "Cottonwood Springs needs you." But when Zachariah finally opened his eyes 3 days later, something had changed. The man who once greeted every morning with a smile and a joke lay silent, his gaze as empty as the desert beyond the town's borders. The townsfolk whispered that Sheriff Jones had died that day, even though his heart still beat. The bullet may have spared his life, but it had stolen his spirit. "He'll never laugh again," they said. "Not after what happened to his brother in that same shootout." They were right. For 2 years, Zachariah Jones performed his duties with mechanical precision. He patrolled the dusty streets of Cottonwood Springs, kept the peace, and enforced the law with unwavering dedication, but the light had gone from his eyes. He spoke only when necessary, ate alone in his small room behind the sheriff's office, and avoided social gatherings like they were outlaws themselves. Until the day Ruby Zimmerman's stagecoach rolled into town. The April sun beat down on Cottonwood Springs as the weekly stagecoach from Tucson rattled down Main Street. Zachariah stood on the boardwalk outside his office, watching with disinterest. The coach carried mail, supplies, and occasionally new faces, temporary visitors passing through on their way to somewhere more promising, or desperate souls hoping to disappear into the vastness of the frontier. This time, amid the usual assortment of dusty travelers, stepped a woman unlike any he'd seen before. She wasn't dressed in the finery of an Eastern lady on adventure, nor did she wear the practical, worn clothing of a settler's wife. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet confidence, her blue calico dress simple but well-fitted, her honey-brown hair pulled back in a neat bun with rebellious tendrils escaping to frame her face. What caught his attention, however, was the large wooden box she carefully lifted from the stagecoach. She struggled with its weight, and when the driver offered assistance, she shook her head firmly. "My responsibility," she said, her voice carrying across the street to where Zachariah stood. "Though I would appreciate directions to Mr. Peterson's general store." The stagecoach driver pointed toward the store 2 buildings down from the sheriff's office. Zachariah found himself watching as she made her way along the boardwalk, the box balanced precariously in her arms. As she passed him, their eyes met briefly. Hers were the warm brown of freshly turned earth, and they widened slightly at the sight of his star. "Sheriff," she acknowledged with a nod, then continued on her way. Zachariah returned to his office, pushing the encounter from his mind. New arrivals were not his concern unless they caused trouble. He had paperwork to complete and a town to patrol. 2 days passed before he saw her again. By then, word had spread through Cottonwood Springs that Miss Ruby Zimmerman had arrived to take over her late uncle's bakery, the small, forgotten shop at the end of Main Street that had been shuttered for the past year. "She's fixing to reopen Peterson's bakery," Mrs. Calloway informed him when she brought him his weekly mending. Imagine that, a single woman running a business all on her own, and from back east, no less. Zachariah merely nodded, uninterested in town gossip, but even he couldn't ignore the activity at the old bakery. The previously dusty windows were now clean, the faded sign had been repainted, and delicious aromas occasionally wafted down the street, making stomachs growl and mouths water. On the 3rd day, Duty forced him to pay a visit. Mayor Thompson had insisted that all business owners be properly registered with the sheriff's office, a formality, but one Zachariah followed diligently. The bell above the door jingled as he entered. The bakery's interior had been transformed. The counters gleamed with fresh polish, new curtains hung in the windows, and several small tables with chairs had been arranged in one corner. The air was heavy with the scent of baking bread and something sweet, cinnamon, perhaps. "I'll be right with you," called a voice from the back room. Moments later, Ruby emerged, her face flushed from the heat of the ovens, a streak of flour across one cheek. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, revealing forearms dusted with flour. Upon seeing him, she straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. "Sheriff Jones," she said. "What brings you to my humble establishment before the grand opening?" "Town regulations," he replied, removing his hat. "All businesses need to be registered." "Of course." She gestured to one of the tables. "Would you care to sit while I find some paper? I'm afraid I'm not quite organized yet." He remained standing, his tall frame stiff. "This won't take long." Ruby studied him for a moment, her head tilted slightly. "Very well. Would you at least accept some coffee while we complete this official business? I just brewed a pot." Before he could refuse, she disappeared into the back room again. Zachariah stood awkwardly, his hat in his hands, surveying the room. The bakery was small but thoughtfully arranged. A glass display case stood empty, waiting for pastries and bread. Behind the counter, shelves had been installed to hold various ingredients. Ruby returned with 2 cups of coffee and set them on the counter. "Now, what information do you need for this registration?" For the next 15 minutes, Zachariah asked routine questions: her full name, place of origin, business plans, expected hours of operation. Ruby answered each one clearly and concisely, occasionally sipping her coffee. "You've come a long way to open a bakery," he observed, looking down at his notes. "Philadelphia to Arizona territory is quite a journey for a woman alone." Ruby's expression remained neutral. "There wasn't much left for me in Philadelphia after my parents passed. When I received word about Uncle Henry's death and his bequest of the bakery to me, it seemed like providence." "You have experience as a baker." A small smile touched her lips. "My father owned a bakery. I grew up with flour in my hair and dough under my fingernails." Her expression clouded momentarily. "After he died, I worked at Harrington's Bakery in Philadelphia for 3 years. Zachariah nodded, making a final note. "Your registration is complete. The bakery can open as planned." He moved to leave, having completed his official business. "Sheriff," Ruby called, stopping him at the door. "Would you care to try a sample? I'm testing recipes for opening day." He turned, ready to decline, when she placed a small plate on the counter with what appeared to be a biscuit, golden brown and flaky. "Buttermilk biscuit with honey," she explained. "Consider it a thank you for helping me with the registration." To refuse would be impolite, and despite his solitary nature, Zachariah had never been intentionally rude. He returned to the counter and picked up the biscuit, taking a small bite. The flavor that spread across his tongue was unexpected, rich, buttery, with just the right amount of sweetness from the honey. It was, perhaps, the first thing he had truly tasted in 2 years. "It's good," he said simply, finishing the biscuit in 2 more bites. Ruby beamed, and for a brief moment, Zachariah felt something stir within him, something he quickly suppressed. "I'm glad you approve, Sheriff. I hope to see you again once we're officially open." He nodded curtly and left, the bell jingling behind him. As he walked back to his office, he found himself remembering the warmth in her brown eyes and the genuine pride in her voice when he'd complimented her baking. It was a strange feeling, noticing such things again. The following Monday, Peterson's Bakery, now renamed Zimmerman's Bakery, opened its doors. Zachariah watched from his office window as townspeople lined up outside, curious and eager to sample the offerings of Cottonwood Springs' newest establishment. By midday, the line had dwindled, but a steady stream of customers continued to enter and exit, many with parcels wrapped in brown paper or munching on pastries as they walked. Mrs. Calloway appeared at his door that afternoon, a small package in her hands. "Sheriff, you need to try Miss Zimmerman's apple tarts. They're simply divine." She placed the package on his desk. The poor dear was running herself ragged by noon, but she looked happier than a lark at sunrise. Zachariah thanked her, and when she left, he unwrapped the package to find two perfectly formed tarts, the pastry golden and flaky, the apple filling fragrant with cinnamon. He ate one immediately, savoring the combination of tart apples and sweet spices, then saved the second for later, a small indulgence he hadn't allowed himself in years. Days passed, and Zimmerman's Bakery quickly became a fixture in Cottonwood Springs. Zachariah observed its success from a distance, incorporating a walk past the bakery into his morning patrol. Sometimes, he would nod to Ruby through the window as she served customers or arranged displays. Occasionally, he would step inside for a cup of coffee and whatever daily special she recommended, their interactions brief but increasingly comfortable. "You should try the sourdough," she suggested one morning, 3 weeks after opening day. "I finally got the starter to behave in this climate." He purchased a loaf, finding it perfect with the venison stew he made that evening. It was during the town's monthly meeting that Zachariah realized how quickly Ruby had integrated into Cottonwood Springs. Mayor Thompson was discussing plans for the upcoming Independence Day celebration when Ruby stood, offering to provide bread and pastries for the community picnic. "And perhaps," she added, "we could organize a baking contest. It would encourage community participation." Her suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement, and Zachariah found himself watching her as she smiled and discussed details with the town's women. She had a way of speaking that made people listen, a quiet confidence that drew others to her. In just a month, she had made more connections in Cottonwood Springs than he had in 3 years as sheriff. As the meeting concluded, Mayor Thompson approached Zachariah. "Sheriff, we're forming committees for the celebration. Would you be willing to oversee security arrangements?" "Of course," he replied. It was his duty after all. "Excellent. You'll be working with Miss Zimmerman on the food committee as well. She'll need assistance with logistics for the baking contest." Before Zachariah could protest, the mayor moved on to speak with someone else, leaving him standing awkwardly near the meeting hall door. As people filed out, Ruby approached him, a notebook in hand. "It seems we'll be collaborating, Sheriff," she said. "Perhaps we could meet tomorrow to discuss arrangements," he nodded stiffly. "My office. 10 o'clock. "I'll bring coffee and scones," she replied with a smile that, despite his best efforts, he found difficult to resist. The next morning, true to her word, Ruby arrived at his office promptly at 10, a basket over her arm that smelled of fresh baking and rich coffee. She set it on his desk and began unpacking a thermos of coffee, 2 cups, plates, napkins, and an assortment of scones. "Blueberry and lemon," she explained, placing one of each on his plate. "I'm experimenting with flavors for the celebration." Zachariah watched her efficient movements, the way she arranged everything just so, before taking a seat across from him. She opened her notebook, revealing pages of neat handwriting. "I've been thinking about the logistics," she began. "If we're to have a baking contest, we'll need judges, categories, and a system for submission." She looked up at him. "But first, try the scones and tell me what you think." He picked up the blueberry scone, noting the perfect golden color and the way the berries had burst during baking, creating pockets of deep purple. He took a bite, and the flavor was extraordinary buttery, not too sweet, with the tartness of the berries providing balance. "Good," he said simply. Ruby smiled, seemingly satisfied with his minimal praise. And the lemon scone was equally impressive, bright with citrus flavor that cut through the richness of the pastry. He nodded his approval. "Excellent," she said, making a note in her book. "Now, about the contest, I was thinking 3 categories: bread, pies, and cakes. Each contestant would bring their entry to the town square by 9 that morning, where the judges would evaluate them based on appearance, creativity, and taste. For the next hour, they discussed the details of the contest, how to prevent cheating, who should judge, what prizes to offer. Zachariah found himself contributing more than he had expected, drawing on his knowledge of the townsfolk to suggest potential judges who were fair-minded and respected. "Sheriff Jones," Ruby said as they concluded their meeting, "I must say you're much more helpful than rumors suggested you would be." He stiffened. "What rumors?" She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Only that you keep to yourself, that you're dedicated to your work but not particularly sociable." "I see no need for excessive socialization to perform my duties," he replied, his tone cooler than before. Ruby gathered her things, packing them neatly back into her basket. "Of course not, but there's more to life than duty, Sheriff." She paused at the door. "Thank you for your help this morning. Shall we meet again next week to finalize the arrangements?" He nodded, already regretting his curt response. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. "Miss Zimmerman." She looked back, waiting. The scones were excellent, both flavors. Her smile returned, warming her eyes. "Thank you, Sheriff. Good day." After she left, Zachariah sat at his desk, staring at the empty plates and cups she had insisted on leaving behind to wash later. Their meeting had been productive, even pleasant. For the first time in years, he had engaged in a conversation that wasn't strictly about law enforcement, and he hadn't found it as uncomfortable as anticipated. The realization troubled him. Over the next few weeks, preparations for the Independence Day celebration intensified. Zachariah and Ruby met regularly to coordinate the baking contest and security arrangements. Each time, she brought something from the bakery: cranberry muffins, cheese biscuits, slices of pound cake, and each time, he found himself looking forward to their meetings more than he cared to admit. During one such meeting, as Ruby was explaining her plan for organizing the contest entries, she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Sheriff Jones," she said, studying him with those perceptive brown eyes, "may I ask you a personal question?" He tensed. "You may ask, I may not answer." She nodded, accepting his terms. "I've been in Cottonwood Springs for almost 2 months now, and in that time I've never seen you smile, not once." She tilted her head slightly. "Were you always so serious, or is it just the burden of your position?" The question struck closer to home than he was comfortable with. Zachariah considered deflecting, giving some non-committal answer, but something about her direct gaze made him reluctant to be dishonest. "I wasn't always like this," he admitted quietly. "Things changed." Ruby waited, clearly hoping he would elaborate. When he didn't, she simply nodded. "I understand. We all have chapters in our lives that change us." She returned her attention to her notes. Now about the judging process. The conversation returned to safer ground, but Zachariah found himself thinking about her question long after she had left. There had been a time when he had been known for his easy laugh and quick wit. A time before the shootout that had nearly taken his life and had claimed his younger brothers. Thomas had been 23, newly deputized, eager to follow in his brother's footsteps. He had no business facing down the Becker gang, but he had insisted on backing up Zachariah when they rode into town. The first bullet had caught Zachariah in the chest. The second had hit Thomas in the throat, killing him almost instantly. Zachariah had survived, but his laughter had died with Thomas. The day before the Independence Day celebration, Cottonwood Springs buzzed with activity. Streets were being decorated, the town square prepared for festivities, and homes filled with the aromas of cooking and baking as contestants prepared their entries for the following day. At Zimmerman's bakery, Ruby had closed early to focus on her contributions to the community picnic. When Zachariah stopped by on his evening patrol to check that all was secure, he was surprised to find the front door unlocked despite the closed sign hanging in the window. Drawing his revolver as a precaution, he entered quietly, the bell above the door muffled by his careful movement. The main shop was empty, but light spilled from the back room along with the sound of someone moving about. "Miss Zimmerman," he called, keeping his gun at the ready. There was a startled gasp, followed by a clatter of metal on wood. "Sheriff Jones, is that you?" Ruby appeared in the doorway, her apron covered in flour, her face flushed from the heat of the ovens. Upon seeing his drawn weapon, her eyes widened. "Is something wrong?" Zachariah holstered his gun, feeling foolish. "Your door was unlocked. I thought there might be an intruder." "Oh." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I must have forgotten to lock it after Mr. Peterson left with his delivery. I'm so sorry to have alarmed you." "It's not safe to leave your door unlocked after hours," he admonished gently, "even in Cottonwood Springs." Ruby nodded, looking contrite. "You're right, of course. I've been so focused on preparing for tomorrow that I've been careless." She hesitated, then gestured toward the back room. "Since you're here, would you mind giving me your opinion on something? I've been experimenting with a new recipe for tomorrow, and I could use an honest assessment." Zachariah checked his pocket watch. His patrol wasn't yet complete, but he had time. "Very well." He followed her into the back room, a space he had never entered before. It was larger than he expected, with two large ovens built into one wall, a massive work table in the center covered with flour, dough, and various baking implements, and shelves lining the walls filled with ingredients and tools. "It's a bit chaotic at the moment," Ruby apologized, moving to the far end of the table where several small loaves of bread were cooling on a rack. "I'm trying to perfect a honey wheat bread that I think would be perfect for the picnic tomorrow." She cut a slice from one of the loaves, placed it on a small plate, and handed it to him. "Tell me what you think. Be brutally honest, my feelings won't be hurt." Zachariah took the plate, noticing the rich golden color of the bread and the way it had risen perfectly, creating a rounded top with a slight split where it had expanded during baking. He took a bite, and the flavors immediately impressed him: a subtle sweetness from the honey, the nutty flavor of the wheat, and a perfect texture that was neither too dense nor too airy. "It's excellent," he said, and meant it. "One of the best breads I've tasted." Ruby beamed, her entire face lighting up with pleasure. "Really? You're not just being kind." "I'm rarely accused of excessive kindness, Miss Zimmerman," he replied dryly. To his surprise, she laughed, a clear, bright sound that seemed to fill the small room. "No, I suppose you're not." "Well, thank you for your honesty." She moved back to the work table. "I'll make a large batch for tomorrow, then. I want everything to be perfect for my first celebration in Cottonwood Springs." As she spoke, she reached for a large sack of flour on a high shelf. The sack, heavier than she anticipated, began to slip. Zachariah moved quickly, stepping forward to help, but he was too late. The sack tipped and fell, hitting the edge of the shelf before landing directly on Ruby's head and shoulders, exploding in a cloud of white powder. For a moment, Both of them stood frozen, Ruby covered from head to toe in flour, looking like a ghost in the lamplight, and Zachariah standing before her, partially coated himself from the billowing cloud. Ruby's expression of shock was comical, her eyes wide in her flour-whitened face, her mouth a perfect O of surprise. A small puff of flour escaped her lips as she exhaled, and then something unexpected happened. It began as a tightness in Zachariah's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. It rose up through his throat, and before he could stop it, a chuckle escaped him. The sound surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise Ruby, whose flour-covered eyebrows rose almost to her hairline. The chuckle grew, fed by the absurdity of Ruby's appearance and her expression of astonishment at his reaction. Soon, Zachariah Jones, the man they said would never laugh again, was laughing openly, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. Ruby, after a moment of stunned silence, joined him, her own laughter mingling with his as she attempted to brush flour from her face, succeeding only in smearing it further. "Look at you," he managed between laughs. "You look like you've seen a ghost and become one at the same time." "Me," she countered, still giggling. "You should see yourself, Sheriff. You've gone prematurely gray." She gestured to his hair and shoulders, now liberally dusted with flour. Their laughter continued, releasing years of tension from Zachariah's body with each breath. When it finally subsided, they stood looking at each other, both breathless and smiling. "Well," Ruby said, wiping tears of mirth from her eyes and leaving flour streaks on her cheeks, "I believe that's the first time I've heard you laugh, Sheriff Jones." The moment seemed suspended in time, Ruby covered in flour, her eyes bright with laughter, and Zachariah feeling lighter than he had in years. Something had shifted between them, a barrier crumbling like the exploded sack of flour. "Zachariah," he said quietly. "My name is Zachariah." Ruby's smile softened. "Zachariah," she repeated, the name sounding different in her voice. "I'm Ruby." The Independence Day celebration dawned bright and clear, the July sun rising into a cloudless blue sky. By mid-morning, the town square was filled with families spreading blankets on the grass, children running and playing, men setting up tables and chairs for the picnic and contests. Zachariah had been up since dawn, ensuring everything was secure and orderly. As he made his rounds, he found himself scanning the crowd for a particular face. He spotted her near the contest tables, directing the arrangement of entries with the confidence he had come to associate with her. Ruby wore a blue dress he hadn't seen before, her hair arranged more elaborately than usual, with blue ribbons woven through the braids wrapped around her head. Even from a distance, he could see the animation in her face as she spoke with the contest participants, examining entries and making notes on her clipboard. As if sensing his gaze, she looked up, her eyes finding his across the square. She smiled and waved, then motioned for him to join her. Without hesitation, he made his way through the crowd. "Good morning, Zachariah," she said as he approached, her use of his given name still new and somehow significant. "We have 23 entries so far, 8 breads, 7 pies, and 8 cakes. The judges will begin at noon." He nodded, noting the impressive display of baked goods arranged on the tables. "Everything looks in order, no security concerns so far." Ruby's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Is that your professional assessment, Sheriff? No potential bread thieves or pie saboteurs lurking about?" The corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Not yet, but the day is young," she laughed, the sound now familiar and welcome to his ears. "Well, I'm counting on you to maintain law and order among the pastries." She glanced at the pocket watch pinned to her dress. "I should check on the picnic preparations. The bread delivery should have arrived by now. As she turned to leave, Zachariah found himself speaking again. "Ruby." She paused, looking back at him questioningly. "Would you? That is, might I escort you to the fireworks display this evening?" The words had left his mouth before he'd fully formed the thought, but once spoken, he found he didn't regret them. Ruby's smile widened, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. "I would like that very much," she replied. "Meet me at the bakery at 7. I'll bring a basket of refreshments." He nodded, a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the July heat. 7 o'clock. The day passed in a blur of activity. The baking contest was a success, with Mrs. Peterson winning the bread category. Young Sally Thompson surprising everyone by taking first prize for pies with her peach creation, and Mrs. Jenkins claiming victory in the cake competition with her 3-layer chocolate masterpiece. The community picnic followed, with townspeople sharing food and conversation under the shade of the large cottonwood trees that gave the town its name. Throughout the day, Zachariah found his gaze continually drawn to Ruby as she moved through the celebration serving food, chatting with townsfolk, organizing activities for the children. She seemed to bring a special energy to everything she touched, an enthusiasm that was infectious. Several times, their eyes met across the square, and each time she smiled at him in a way that made his heart beat faster. It was a feeling he had almost forgotten, this anticipation, this awareness of another person. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. At 7 o'clock precisely, Zachariah arrived at Zimmerman's bakery. He had returned to his quarters to change into a clean shirt and his best vest, and had even polished his boots. He carried his hat in his hands as he knocked on the bakery door, feeling unaccountably nervous. Ruby opened the door almost immediately, as if she had been waiting nearby. She had changed as well, into a dress of soft yellow that complemented her coloring. Her hair was down now, falling in waves around her shoulders, with just a simple yellow ribbon holding it back from her face. "Right on time," she said with a smile, stepping aside to let him enter. "I've packed a basket for us, some of that honey wheat bread you liked, cheese, cold chicken, and a bottle of apple cider. I thought we might find a good spot on the hill to watch the fireworks." Zachariah nodded, taking the basket she offered. "There's a clearing near the top with a good view of the town. Not many people know about it." They walked together through the town, which was still filled with celebrants enjoying the holiday. Several people greeted them as they passed, a few raising eyebrows at the sight of the solitary sheriff in the company of the baker. Zachariah found he didn't mind their curiosity as much as he might have expected. The path to the hill led away from the town, winding through scrubby desert vegetation that gradually gave way to more substantial growth as they climbed. Ruby walked beside him, occasionally commenting on plants she recognized or asking about those unfamiliar to her. "It's so different from Philadelphia," she said as they neared the top. "The landscape, the plants, even the quality of the light. When I first arrived, I thought I'd never adjust, but now I find I'm growing quite fond of it. It grows on you," Zachariah agreed. "I felt the same when I first came west from Kentucky." "Kentucky?" Ruby looked at him with interest. "I didn't know you were from the East as well," he nodded. "Born and raised in Louisville. My father was a carpenter, my mother a school teacher." "And what brought you west?" Zachariah hesitated. He rarely spoke of his past, but with Ruby, the words came more easily than expected. "After the war, there wasn't much left for me in Kentucky. Too many memories. My brother Thomas and I decided to head west, look for a fresh start." He paused, then added quietly, "Thomas always had a sense of adventure. Said the frontier was where we'd make our fortune." Ruby's expression softened with understanding. "He was the brother who died in the shootout," she said gently. I've heard some of the story from Mrs. Calloway. Zachariah nodded, his throat tight. 2 years ago. He was my deputy. Too young, too eager to prove himself. They had reached the clearing he'd mentioned, a flat area near the top of the hill with a perfect view of Cottonwood Springs below. In the distance, the town glowed with lanterns and bonfires in preparation for the fireworks display. Ruby spread a blanket on the ground, and they sat side by side, the basket between them. As she began unpacking their picnic, she spoke again. "I lost my brother too," she said quietly. "In the war. He was only 19 when he enlisted, so proud in his uniform." She handed Zachariah a plate with bread, cheese, and chicken. "It never stops hurting, does it? But after a while, the good memories start to outweigh the pain of loss." Zachariah accepted the plate, studying her face in the fading light. "Is that why you came west? To escape the memories?" She shook her head. "Not to escape them, to honor them in a way. James always talked about seeing the West. After our parents died influenza, 3 years ago, there was nothing keeping me in Philadelphia. When I received the letter about Uncle Henry leaving me the bakery, it felt like James was giving me a nudge." She smiled sadly. "He always did try to look out for me, even when we were children." They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching as the sky darkened and stars appeared one by one. Below them, Cottonwood Springs twinkled with lights. "Thank you," Zachariah said suddenly. Ruby looked at him questioningly. "For what?" "For yesterday. For making me laugh again." He met her gaze steadily. It had been a long time. Her smile in response was warm, touching her eyes. "You have a wonderful laugh, Zachariah. It shouldn't be hidden away." Before he could respond, the first firework exploded in the sky, a burst of red and gold that illuminated their faces. Ruby's expression of delight, as she watched the display, stirred something in Zachariah's chest, a protective tenderness he hadn't felt in years. As the fireworks continued, painting the night sky with color, Ruby gradually moved closer to him on the blanket until their shoulders were nearly touching. When a particularly loud explosion made her start, she instinctively reached out, her hand finding his arm. "Sorry," she murmured, beginning to pull away. Zachariah caught her hand in his, holding it gently. "It's all right," he said, his voice low. They remained that way for the rest of the display, hands clasped between them, watching as the night sky bloomed with light and color. When the final barrage of fireworks faded and the distant sounds of cheering rose from the town, neither of them moved immediately. "I should get you back," Zachariah said eventually, though he made no move to release her hand. Ruby nodded but turned to face him. In the starlight, her eyes seemed to hold their own luminescence. "Zachariah," she said softly, "I've enjoyed this evening very much." "As have I," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. She smiled, then leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you for sharing your special place with me." The warmth of her lips lingered on his skin as they packed up the remains of their picnic and made their way back down the hill. They walked close together, occasionally brushing hands until they reached the town, where the celebration was beginning to wind down. At the door of the bakery, they paused. Zachariah handed her the basket, their fingers touching briefly in the exchange. "Good night, Ruby," he said, reluctant to leave. "Good night, Zachariah," she replied. Then, with a small smile, she added, "I'll see you tomorrow. I'm trying a new cinnamon roll recipe you might enjoy." He nodded, recognizing the invitation for what it was, a promise of continued connection. "I look forward to it." As he walked back to his quarters that night, Zachariah realized that for the first time in 2 years, he was actually looking forward to the dawn. The weeks following the Independence Day celebration brought a subtle but significant change to Zachariah's routine. His morning patrol now always included a stop at Zimmerman's bakery, where Ruby would greet him with coffee and whatever she had fresh from the oven. Sometimes he would stay for a few minutes, sometimes longer, their conversations growing deeper and more personal with each encounter. He learned that she loved thunderstorms but was afraid of snakes, that she could read both French and German but couldn't sing a note in tune, that she kept a journal where she recorded new recipe ideas, and that her favorite color was yellow, because it's impossible to be sad when surrounded by yellow. In turn, he found himself sharing parts of his own life that he had kept locked away, stories of his childhood in Kentucky, memories of his parents and Thomas, his experiences during the war, and his dreams of someday owning a small ranch outside of town where he could raise horses. "You'd be good with horses," Ruby had commented one morning as they sat at one of the small tables in the bakery, sharing coffee and fresh scones. "You have a calm presence. Animals respond to that." Her observation had pleased him more than he could express. It was one of many things he appreciated about Ruby, her ability to see beyond the surface, to recognize qualities in him that others missed. As summer progressed, their relationship deepened. Zachariah began escorting Ruby to church on Sundays, walking her home afterward and often staying for dinner. They attended town gatherings together, rode out to picnic by the creek on his rare days off, and spent quiet evenings on the small porch behind the bakery, talking or simply enjoying each other's company under the star-filled Arizona sky. The townsfolk noticed, of course. Cottonwood Springs was too small for such a development to go unremarked. But to Zachariah's surprise, the comments he overheard were generally supportive. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Calloway remarked to Mrs. Peterson as they left the general store one afternoon. "But that Baker girl has worked a miracle on our sheriff. Did you see him actually smiling during the town meeting last night?" "They're good for each other," Mr. Peterson replied. "She brings out his humanity, and he gives her stability. Mark my words, we'll be hearing wedding bells before Christmas." The prediction made Zachariah uncomfortable, not because it was unwelcome, but because it laid bare feelings he was still coming to terms with himself. He had not courted a woman since before the war, and his feelings for Ruby were different from anything he had experienced before, deeper, more complex, both comforting and unsettling in their intensity. One evening in late August, as they sat on Ruby's porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Zachariah found himself studying her profile, the delicate curve of her nose, the way her eyelashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the soft line of her mouth currently curved in a small smile of contentment. "What are you thinking?" she asked, turning to catch him watching her. "That you're beautiful," he answered honestly, the words coming more easily than they once would have. Her cheeks colored slightly, but she held his gaze. "You've changed since I met you, Zachariah Jones." He nodded. "Because of you." Ruby shook her head. "No, not because of me. The change was already within you. She paused, searching for the right words. "Perhaps I just provided the opportunity for it to emerge, like flour on a sheriff," he suggested, his mouth quirking in the half-smile that was becoming more frequent. She laughed, the sound still as delightful to him as the first time he'd heard it. "Exactly like flour on a sheriff." Their eyes held, and in that moment, something shifted between them once again. Zachariah reached out, taking her hand in his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "Ruby," he began, his voice low and serious, "I'm not a man of many words, as you know, but these past months, knowing you has brought light back into my life when I thought it was gone forever." He took a deep breath. "I care for you deeply, more than I can properly express." Ruby's eyes softened, her free hand coming up to touch his cheek. "Oh, Zachariah, I care for you too, so very much." The space between them seemed to disappear as he leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. When their lips met, it was gentle at first, a question, an offering. Ruby's hand moved from his cheek to the back of his neck, drawing him closer as she responded with a warmth that answered every unspoken question. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Zachariah rested his forehead against hers. "I should go," he murmured, though it was the last thing he wanted to do. Ruby nodded reluctantly. "I suppose you should. People will talk." "Let them," he replied, surprising himself with his lack of concern. "They already do." She smiled, pressing one more quick kiss to his lips before standing. "Even so, you're the sheriff. You have a reputation to maintain." He walked home that night feeling as though his boots barely touched the ground. For the first time in years, Zachariah Jones could envision a future filled with something more than duty and solitude, a future that included laughter, warmth, and Ruby Zimmerman. The following Sunday, after church, Zachariah asked Ruby if she would accompany him on a ride the next day, his day off. She agreed readily, promising to prepare a picnic lunch for them to share. Monday dawned clear and mild, a perfect early September day. Zachariah arrived at the bakery at 10 o'clock as planned, leading 2 horses, his own bay gelding, and a gentle chestnut mare borrowed from the livery stable. Ruby emerged from the bakery wearing a practical riding skirt and jacket, her hair braided and pinned securely for the ride. She carried a large basket that she handed to Zachariah before accepting his help mounting the chestnut mare. "She's lovely," Ruby commented, patting the mare's neck. "What's her name?" "Penny," Zachariah replied, securing the picnic basket to his saddle. "Mr. Thompson says she's as gentle as they come, but spirited enough to keep up with Buck here." He patted his own horse's neck. They rode out of town, heading west, following a well-worn trail that wound through desert scrubland before gradually climbing into the foothills. Ruby was a competent rider, sitting easy in the saddle and handling Penny with quiet confidence. "My father insisted all his children learn to ride," she explained when Zachariah commented on her skill. "He said you never knew when a good seat might save your life." Of course, in Philadelphia, riding was more a social activity than a necessity, but I always enjoyed it. They rode for about an hour, the landscape changing around them as they gained elevation. Scrub gave way to scattered pines, and the view expanded, offering glimpses of the desert floor stretching away to distant mountains. Finally, they reached a small plateau where a cluster of large boulders provided natural seating beside a shallow stream that bubbled over rocks, creating a musical accompaniment to the calls of birds and the rustling of pine needles in the breeze. "It's beautiful here," Ruby said as Zachariah helped her dismount. "How did you find this place?" "Thomas and I discovered it about a month after we arrived in Cottonwood Springs," he replied, leading the horses to the stream to drink. "We were tracking some strays from the Peterson Ranch and stopped here for lunch." His expression grew distant with memory. "Thomas said it was the prettiest spot in the territory." Ruby touched his arm gently. He was right. They spread their picnic on a flat boulder near the stream, cold chicken, bread still slightly warm from the oven, cheese, apples, and 2 slices of Ruby's famous apple pie. As they ate, they talked of small things, town gossip, plans for the upcoming harvest festival, a book Ruby was reading that Zachariah had recommended. After they had finished eating and were sitting side by side on the boulder, watching the play of sunlight on the water, Zachariah reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object. "I have something for you," he said, suddenly nervous. It's not much, but when I saw it, I thought of you." He held out his hand, revealing a small brooch in the shape of a sunflower, crafted from gold and amber. Ruby's eyes widened as she took it, turning it to catch the light. "Zachariah, it's beautiful," she breathed. "But what's the occasion?" He shook his head. "No occasion, just because you're like that flower. You bring brightness wherever you go." Ruby's eyes filled with tears, though her smile was radiant. "That's the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me." She pinned the brooch to her jacket just over her heart. "I'll treasure it always." Zachariah took her hand in his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Ruby, there's something I need to ask you." Her expression grew serious, expectant. "Yes." He took a deep breath, gathering his courage. "These past months have been the happiest I can remember. You've brought joy and meaning back into my life in ways I never expected." He met her gaze directly. "I love you, Ruby Zimmerman, and if you'll have me, I'd be honored to have you as my wife." For a moment, Ruby sat perfectly still, her eyes wide and full of emotion. Then, with a small cry, she threw her arms around his neck, nearly knocking him off the boulder. "Yes," she whispered against his ear. "Yes, Zachariah Jones, I will marry you. I love you with all my heart." He held her tightly, his heart so full he thought it might burst. When she pulled back slightly to look at him, her cheeks wet with happy tears, he kissed her with all the passion and tenderness he felt, sealing their promise to each other. They remained at the plateau for another hour, making plans for their future together. Ruby would keep the bakery, of course, and Zachariah would continue as sheriff for now, but they agreed to start looking for a small property outside town where they could eventually build a home and raise horses, as he had dreamed. "And children," Ruby added softly, "if you want them." Zachariah's throat tightened at the thought. "I do," he managed. "Very much." The ride back to Cottonwood Springs was filled with a quiet joy, both of them occasionally reaching out to touch the other, as if to reassure themselves that this happiness was real. As they approached town, Ruby looked at him with a mischievous smile. "When shall we tell everyone? Or shall we let them guess when I start wearing your ring?" Zachariah considered this. "I thought perhaps we could announce it at the Harvest Festival next month. But if you'd prefer to tell people sooner." She shook her head. "The Harvest Festival sounds perfect. It will give us a little time to enjoy this just between us." Her smile widened. "Though I'm not sure how well I'll be able to hide my happiness. Mrs. Calloway is remarkably perceptive." He chuckled, the sound now coming naturally to him. "That she is, but we can try." In the end, they managed to keep their engagement private for only a week before Mrs. Calloway cornered Ruby in the bakery and directly asked why she was glowing like a lantern at dusk. Ruby's blush and stammered response were all the confirmation the older woman needed. By that afternoon, most of Cottonwood Springs knew that Sheriff Jones and Miss Zimmerman were to be married. The news was met with general approval and a flood of well wishes, along with some good-natured teasing directed at Zachariah by the men of the town. "Never thought I'd see the day," Deputy Wilson said with a grin as they made their evening rounds. "You're a lucky man, Sheriff." "Miss Zimmerman is a fine woman." "I know it," Zachariah replied simply. The weeks leading up to the Harvest Festival were busy ones. In addition to their regular duties, Zachariah and Ruby began making preparations for their wedding, which they had decided would take place in December, just before Christmas. Ruby worked with Mrs. Peterson to design a wedding dress, while Zachariah, with the help of Mr. Thompson and several other men from town, began construction on a small house on a plot of land about a mile outside of Cottonwood Springs, land he had purchased years ago, but had never developed. "It won't be ready by December," he warned Ruby as they visited the site one evening after work. "But by spring, we should be able to move in." Ruby surveyed the partially framed structure, her eyes alight with excitement. "It's going to be wonderful, Zachariah, our home." The harvest festival arrived on a perfect October day, cool but sunny, with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at it. The town square was decorated with corn stalks, pumpkins, and autumn flowers, and tables were laden with the bounty of local farms and gardens. Ruby had been up since before dawn, preparing special harvest breads and pastries for the bakery's booth. Zachariah had been equally busy, ensuring security for the festival and helping with last-minute preparations. They had agreed to meet at noon for the official announcement of their engagement, which Mayor Thompson would make before the start of the harvest feast. As Zachariah made his way through the crowded square toward the central platform where the mayor waited, he caught sight of Ruby approaching from the opposite direction. She wore a dress the color of ripe wheat, with the sunflower brooch pinned at her throat. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate crown of braids interwoven with small autumn flowers, and her cheeks were flushed with excitement. To Zachariah, she had never looked more beautiful. As they met at the steps of the platform, he offered her his arm. "Ready?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her smile radiant. "More than ready." Together, they climbed the steps to join Mayor Thompson, who beamed at them before turning to address the gathered townsfolk. "Friends and neighbors," he called, his voice carrying across the square. "Before we begin our feast, I have a joyful announcement to make." He gestured to Zachariah and Ruby. "Our esteemed Sheriff Jones and our beloved Miss Zimmerman have informed me of their intention to marry this coming December." A cheer went up from the crowd, accompanied by applause and a few good-natured whistles. "I think I speak for all of Cottonwood Springs," the mayor continued when the noise had subsided, "when I say that this union brings us all great happiness. Sheriff Jones has protected and served our community with unwavering dedication, and Miss Zimmerman has, in her short time with us, become an essential part of our town's fabric." He raised his hands. "Let us celebrate not only our harvest today but also this promise of new beginnings." Another cheer rose from the crowd as Zachariah and Ruby descended from the platform to be surrounded by well-wishers. For the next hour, they were barely able to speak to each other as they accepted congratulations and answered questions about their plans. Finally, as the feast began and attention turned to the abundant food, they were able to find a quiet moment together at the edge of the square. "Are you happy?" Zachariah asked, looking down at Ruby's flushed face. She reached up to touch his cheek. "Completely. Are you?" His answer was a smile, the full, unguarded smile that had once been so rare, but now came easily in her presence. "More than I ever thought possible." The weeks between the harvest festival and their wedding day passed in a blur of activity. Zachariah divided his time between his duties as sheriff and work on their new house, determined to have at least part of it habitable by spring. Ruby was equally busy with the bakery, which had become even more popular as the holiday season approached, and with preparations for the wedding. They had decided on a simple ceremony at the town church, followed by a reception at the hotel dining room, which was the only space in Cottonwood Springs large enough to accommodate all the guests they wished to invite. December arrived with cool, clear days and cold nights. As the wedding day approached, excitement built not only for the couple but for the entire town, which had embraced their romance as a symbol of hope and renewal. The night before the wedding, after the rehearsal dinner at the hotel, Zachariah walked Ruby back to the bakery. They stood on the porch, reluctant to part, despite knowing they would see each other in just a few hours. "This time tomorrow you'll be Mrs. Jones," Zachariah said softly, holding both her hands in his. Ruby smiled up at him. And you'll be stuck with a wife who will undoubtedly cover you in flour on a regular basis." He chuckled, pulling her gently into his arms. "I can think of worse fates." Their kiss was tender, filled with promise and anticipation. When they finally parted, Ruby rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never expected to find you," she murmured. "When I came to Cottonwood Springs, I was only looking for a fresh start, a place to belong." Zachariah stroked her hair. "And I had stopped looking for anything beyond the next day's duties." He tilted her face up to his. "Thank you for helping me find my way back to life." Her eyes shone with unshed tears. "Thank you for learning to laugh again." They shared one more kiss before Zachariah reluctantly took his leave, tradition dictating that they not see each other until the ceremony the next day. December 18, 1880, dawned bright and clear, the air crisp with winter but warmed by a brilliant sun. By noon, the church was filled to capacity, with additional chairs set up in the back to accommodate everyone who wished to attend. Zachariah stood at the altar, uncharacteristically nervous, tugging at the collar of his new suit. Beside him, Deputy Wilson, serving as best man, leaned over to whisper reassuringly, "Relax, Sheriff. She'll be here." As if on cue, the church doors opened, and Mrs. Peterson began playing the piano. The assembled guests rose to their feet as Ruby appeared in the doorway, a vision in ivory satin and lace, a small bouquet of winter flowers in her hands. Mrs. Calloway, who had become like a mother to Ruby, walked beside her, ready to give her away in the absence of her own family. The moment Zachariah saw her, his nervousness vanished, replaced by a certainty so profound it nearly took his breath away. This was right. This was meant to be. Ruby's eyes found his as she began her walk down the aisle, and the smile they shared was private, intimate, despite the crowd of witnesses. The ceremony itself was brief but deeply meaningful. They had written their own vows, simple promises to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When Zachariah slipped the gold band onto Ruby's finger, his hands were steady, his voice clear as he pledged himself to her. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Pastor Mitchell declared. "You may kiss your bride." Zachariah took Ruby's face gently between his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of many in the congregation. The kiss sealed their union, a promise of the life they would build together. The reception at the hotel was a joyous celebration, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed the entire county, it seemed. Ruby had, of course, baked their wedding cake herself, a three-tiered creation decorated with crystallized flowers and topped with miniature figures of a sheriff and a baker. As the afternoon turned to evening, Zachariah and Ruby moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes. They had decided to spend their wedding night at the hotel before departing the next day for a short honeymoon in Tucson. "Mrs. Jones," Zachariah said as they shared their first dance as husband and wife, "how does it feel?" Ruby's eyes sparkled up at him. "Wonderful. Perfect. Though I may need some time to get used to the name." He spun her gently, then pulled her close again. "We have all the time in the world." As the celebration continued around them, they found a moment of quiet in a corner of the room, watching their friends and neighbors enjoy the festivities. "Look," Ruby said softly, nodding toward where Mrs. Calloway was deep in conversation with Mr. Peterson, both of them laughing at some shared joke. "I think there might be another romance brewing in Cottonwood Springs." Zachariah followed her gaze, his arm tightening around her waist. "Seems we started a trend." She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I hope they find the happiness we have." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "That's a rare thing, what we've found." And it was true. What had begun with a sack of flour and an unexpected laugh had blossomed into a love deeper and more sustaining than either of them had dared to hope for, a love that had brought healing to old wounds and promise for new beginnings. Spring, 1882, the morning sun streamed through the curtains of the bedroom window, painting golden patterns on the quilt. Ruby stirred, her eyes opening slowly to find Zachariah already awake beside her, watching her with a tenderness that still made her heart skip after more than a year of marriage. "Good morning, Mrs. Jones," he murmured, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from her face. She smiled, stretching languidly. "Good morning, Sheriff. How long have you been awake?" "Not long." He leaned over to kiss her softly. "Just enjoying the view." Ruby laughed, pushing him playfully. "Charmer." She sat up, glancing toward the window. "It looks like a beautiful day." Their home, completed the previous summer, stood on a gentle rise overlooking a small valley where Zachariah had begun raising horses as he'd always dreamed. The house wasn't large, but it was solidly built and filled with light. 4 rooms downstairs and 2 upstairs, with a wide porch wrapping around 3 sides and a kitchen garden that was Ruby's pride and joy. Despite moving to the outskirts of town, Ruby had kept the bakery open, riding in most days to bake and serve customers before returning home in the afternoon. Zachariah continued as sheriff, though he had been training Deputy Wilson to take on more responsibilities, planning for a day when he might step back to focus on his growing horse business. They had settled into a rhythm that suited them both, independent in their work, but deeply connected in their life together. Their home had become a gathering place for friends from town, with Sunday dinners on the porch a regular tradition during good weather. This particular morning, however, was special. Ruby had news to share, news she had confirmed with Doc Holliday the day before, but had saved to tell Zachariah on this day, their wedding anniversary. She watched him now as he rose from the bed and moved to the wash basin, splashing water on his face before beginning to shave. The morning light highlighted the contours of his bare back and shoulders, still strong and fit despite the scars that told the story of his past. His hair had more silver at the temples than when they'd met, but it only made him more distinguished in her eyes. "I was thinking," she began casually, reaching for her robe, "that we might need to consider adding another room to the house soon." Zachariah paused, razor in hand, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "Oh, are you expecting more overnight guests than usual for the summer?" Ruby moved to stand behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her cheek against his back. "Not exactly. But in about 7 months, we'll have a permanent addition to the household." She felt him go still, then slowly turn in her arms to face her. "Ruby," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you saying?" She nodded, her eyes filling with happy tears. "We're going to have a baby, Zachariah. Dr. Holliday confirmed it yesterday." For a moment, he simply stared at her, wonder and joy dawning on his face. Then, with a whoop that startled both of them, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, laughing with pure delight. "A baby," he exclaimed, setting her gently back on her feet but keeping his arms around her. "Our baby," Ruby laughed through her tears, touching his face. "You're happy then?" "Happy doesn't begin to describe it." He kissed her deeply, then pulled back to look at her with concern. "How are you feeling? Is everything all right? Should you be resting?" She shook her head, amused by his sudden protectiveness. "I'm perfectly fine, Zachariah. Doc Holliday says I'm healthy as a horse, one of yours, not some old nag." She patted her still flat stomach. "This little one and I are doing just fine." He placed his hand over hers, his expression softening into one of awe. "A baby," he repeated quietly. "I never thought. After Thomas died, I didn't think I'd have a family of my own." Ruby leaned up to kiss him again. Life has a way of surprising us, doesn't it? Like a sack of flour to the head. Zachariah laughed, the sound free and joyous in a way that still thrilled her every time she heard it. Indeed it does, my love. Indeed it does. They spent the morning planning and dreaming, discussing names, debating whether the nursery should be downstairs or up, wondering if the child would have Ruby's eyes or Zachariah's height. Later, as they sat on the porch enjoying coffee and the fresh bread Ruby had baked the day before, Zachariah reached for her hand. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For bringing flour into my life." His eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Both kinds." Ruby squeezed his hand, her heart full. "Thank you for learning to laugh again." As they sat together, looking out over the land that had become their home, Ruby thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a sack of flour in a bakery to a life built on love and the promise of new beginnings. They had found in each other not just love but healing, not just companionship but completion. And as the morning sun warmed their faces and the future stretched before them, filled with possibilities, Ruby knew that this was just the beginning of their story, a story of flour and laughter, of healing and hope, of love that had transformed two solitary souls into a family. In the years that followed, Cottonwood Springs would see many changes. The town would grow, the territory would become a state, and new faces would replace old ones. But the story of Sheriff Jones and his baker wife would be told, and retold, how a woman with flour in her hair had taught a wounded man to laugh again, and how that laughter had grown into a love that became the stuff of legend in their little corner of the West. And on a small ranch outside town, surrounded by horses and children and friends, Zachariah and Ruby Jones would continue to build their life together, one day at a time, with flour on their hands and laughter in their hearts.